Hey everyone, Brian from Focus, and today we get to finish up the second chapter of John in our study, focusing on the growth of the disciples throughout this gospel. Last week we looked at Jesus' first public miracle, the miracle at the wedding feast, turning water into wine. Now we know that in John's gospel he pairs signs that Jesus does, or miracles that Jesus does, with conversations, with discourses. And he pairs them up and relates them. Kind of like explaining why Jesus did this sign. Why is this sign important? What is the meaning behind this sign? Because John writes this gospel for a specific purpose. And that purpose is found in John 20:31. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So John here, with this thesis statement in mind, recalls the turning the water into wine, along with the discourse and the conversation, not here, but in the next chapter with Nicodemus. This last part of chapter 2, the purifying of the temple, and the explanation of and the foretelling of Jesus' death and resurrection, is a bridge that is going to connect and going to prompt Nicodemus to find Jesus. This event is going to be very, very public. Unlike his first miracle he did, was a private event, a wedding ceremony among intimate friends and family. This is going to be at the Passover, one of the 3 required feasts the Jews must go and come, or go up to, as it says, to Jerusalem to celebrate this feast. And because Jesus did this so publicly, it got the attention of everyone, including Nicodemus, as we're going to see in next chapter. So this is kind of like the prequel of what is going to happen in chapter 3. But it's nothing of less importance than the miracle done before or the conversation ahead of time. And we're going to look at that. So John chapter 2 verses 13 through 17. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple. With the sheep and the oxen he poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold the doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." First thing we notice in verse 13, it says that Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now we talked a little bit about this at the close when Jesus traveled from Cana to Capernaum. He said it went down to Capernaum, but actually Capernaum was a little bit north, and we found out that the directions and how the Jews would communicate their travel destination wouldn't be on the cardinal directions as, like an example that we used, going from San Diego to LA. We would say we would go up to LA on there because we're going north, or down to Mexico because we're going south. They use going up or down based on elevation. Now this is way down there. From Capernaum, they're going to go all the way alongside the Sea of Galilee, along the River Jordan, over to Jericho, and then due west to Jerusalem. And because Jerusalem is on Mount Zion, on a mountain, and Capernaum is at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, they are going to go up in elevation. They are going to go up to Jerusalem. And it was about a 3 to 4 day journey along the River Jordan, again, as we talked about. Now, it said that when he arrived, he found at the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers doing business. But why were they doing that? They were doing that because they were there to celebrate the Passover. And we know that the Passover was celebrated in a remembrance and a memorial for what God did in freeing the Hebrews from slavery, from the Godhead, Pharaoh. God sent all those plagues. He went and hardened Pharaoh's heart all the way up until the end of the final plague, the plague of death. And God said in Exodus 12, we can find it, that God instructed the Hebrews to go about and sacrifice a lamb. And when they sacrificed the lamb, they took the blood of the lamb and outlined the doorposts of their house. And as long as that blood was there to outline the doorposts of their house, the angel of death passed over the house and did not enter the house. It is a true symbol, a true representation, and a perfect representation of Jesus here and why he came on this earth to die for us, that he may be that blood, so that the angel of a death, the eternal separation from God, and being that judgment to be fall upon us and to be found guilty, all of that would be passed over us because of Jesus' blood. Remember how John the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb of God," right, who takes away the sin of the world? That Lamb of God, that same symbol that God had the Hebrews use at the first Passover, is now here in celebrating his first Passover after being anointed at the baptism, after the official beginning of his ministry, of why he is on this earth, to be that sacrificial lamb for us. So this is what Jesus is entering. He's coming down most likely in a caravan with his family and the people that he knows, travels these 3 to 4 days from Capernaum all the way up to Jerusalem. And he's entering Jerusalem, and he has tens of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of people here in Jerusalem to celebrate this Passover. Remember, it is a requirement for all the Jews, even abroad, to come and celebrate this Passover. Not just the locals, but from every Jew. They make this multiple day journey to come to Jerusalem to celebrate this Passover. It is an amazing spectacle, an amazing celebration, an amazing remembrance that is taking place here. But at the same time, as we're going to see, that it is also a time that was being used as personal gain, as personal profit, and people were very much being taken advantage of. And we see that in verse 14. It was not wrong for animals to be sold for sacrificial purposes. In fact, you read in Deuteronomy 14, 24 through 26, and let's just read this real quick. 24 through 26, these 3 verses. And if the way is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe when the Lord your God blessed you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into the money, and bind up the money in your hand, and go to the place that the Lord your God chooses, and spend the money for whatever you desire, oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, whatever the appetite craves. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and rejoice in and your household. This again was a feast. This was a celebration. So the animals would be sacrificed, and then they would be consumed with it. Now, Jesus' journey from Capernaum was 3 to 4 days. Many Jews traveled even farther from that. 3 to 4 days. A lot can happen if you're traveling. Remember, the sacrifice needed to be an unblemished animal with no spot. Basically, your best of the best animal. A lot can happen along a hard, grueling journey that's going to last multiple days. So God knew this. God understood this. So in the law, when he gave the law to Moses to give to the children of Israel, he put this in here. He put, hey, I understand. A lot can happen on this journey. If you're going to take your best of your best, why don't you do this? Why don't you, at the place of where you're from, take that best lamb, take that best goat, or whatever it is that you are going to sacrifice based on your income and what you're able to. But take your best. Sell it there. And then when you sell it there, you can go ahead and take what you sold it for, bring it to Jerusalem, and then go ahead and buy your sacrifice there in Jerusalem. Totally okay. 100% okay. But what the problem was, not only were they basically ripping people off by raising the prices, but also they were doing this inside the temple. And when the temple was actually first built, they wouldn't do this inside the temple. They actually did it. If you find here in this map, right there where the number 7 is, in the Kidron Valley, that's where they did the exchanges. That's where they did the business aspect of this. They didn't do it inside the temple, because the temple was to be held in reverence. The temple was not to be a place that was to conduct business. When people were in the temple, they were there to worship, and that's it. Nothing else. To worship. So when they started doing business in the temple, and even though they were trying to justify this as being in the outer courts, as you get to see here in this picture of the temple, also labeled 7, also known as the Gentile court. Now, all Jews can enter into the inner part of the temple, beginning with the court of the women would be the inner. But these exchanges that Jesus went in and drove out the animals and overturned the money changers happened in the outer court, the court of the Gentiles. Just think about that. When you pass into the temple here, when you can see this temple from a great distance away. When you enter the city of Jerusalem, you can see this temple. This temple, or the outer temple walls, are the highest points in the city of Jerusalem. I mean, look at this representation here of this model of Jerusalem, looking north from the city of David toward the temple. It's huge. It's like it's like coming up on today in a huge arena, a huge stadium. You're not going to miss it. It's huge. So here you are approaching. It's supposed to be the holiest place that is around that you've ever seen before. The temple, and also Herod's temple, the reconstruction of this temple, is one of the 7 wonders of the world. It is a spectacle to see. So you have all of this going on. You're approaching this. You're starting to prepare your heart for pure worship. You go and you can't see what's going on inside. All you hear is this lot of people, a lot of movement going on, but you're not sure what's going on inside, what it actually looks like because of the walls. So as you approach this temple, as you're preparing your heart, the first thing that you see is business being done. Not worship, not animals with the sacrifice, not reverence, but business. About people making profit, about people taking advantage of each other. This is not the place. First of all, that's wrong. But even if it was pure, even if it was done rightly, this is not the place to do that. And Jesus is going to make a huge point that this is not the place. Even if their hearts were pure, this is not the place to do that. That's why when we are about ready to take the memorial of the Lord's table of communion, when we're about ready to take that, Paul warns us to first check our heart, to first look inside us, because of the reverence of that memorial, because of the seriousness that took place on that cross of the shedding of the blood, what Jesus did for us. They're there to celebrate a Passover of God preserving his people and preserving his promise, what he did for them, by passing over their house with the angel of death, so that their firstborn may live. And this is what they turn in. This is the first thing that they are seeing. Business being done, people being taken advantage of. And it wasn't until this point, it wasn't until Jesus was baptized and ordained and started his public ministry, that he realized that he has now with the authority to go out and do this cleansing. It says in verse 15 that Jesus made a whip. This whip was not to be used and was not used on people. First of all, this whip was to be used to drive out the animals, to get them out of the temple. If he were to use the whip on people, would there be people left to talk to him afterwards? No, there wouldn't. Jesus used this whip to drive out the animals. It was not used as a weapon. It was not used as anything other than to get the animals moving in the direction that Jesus wanted them to go. So he used his whip to drive out the animals, and he overturned the money changers. And then he set tables. Obviously, the money changers were on the tables. So when he overturned one, he overturned the other. Maybe that's what Jesus used to demonstrate, you have made this a den of thieves. This is thievery. This is robbery. This is not right what you're doing here. So not only did he drive out the animals to show that this is not the place to conduct that business. This is not the place to sell these animals. Right or wrong, this is not the place. Go back where it was originally intended and done in the Kidron Valley, and that's where it's going to be done at. But also Jesus overturned the money changers. Why? Because there was thievery there. You know and I know when we go to big events, i.e. arena, football games or baseball games or whatever the case may be, how much is a hot dog? How much is a glass of water? How much is some popcorn? Right? The food and the pricing and the concessions are astronomical. It is a huge ripoff. Why? Because they can do it. Because when people are in there and you're not allowed to bring food in there, or you're hungry and you can't leave to go get food, you're stuck. You're going to go and buy something to eat, and they know this, so they jack up the prices. Same kind of idea that was being done here. They knew hundreds of thousands of people were going to come through those temple gates, and they were going to be there with money. And they needed, according to the law, to buy a sacrificial animal. So what did? They jacked up the prices. And they were stuck, and people had to pay. So Jesus overturned the money changers as well because of the thievery that was being done at this time. Now, real quickly, we need to address that there's a little bit of disagreement among scholars here. There's a little bit of disagreement on whether or not this truly is a cleansing that took place in the beginning of Jesus' ministry, or is this just John putting this here because, remember, he wrote this gospel to serve the purpose of his thesis, that we may believe in his name, that Jesus is the Son of God. Right? So we have scholars that believe that this is just John remembering what Jesus did after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And John just put it here as to serve the purpose of defending his thesis? Or is this truly two events, one done at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and one done at the end of Jesus' ministry? Which way you're going to believe still can serve the purpose of this gospel. Meaning that this event, whether it's a remembering of what happened later on, and John just put it here out of chronological order, or is this truly an isolated or its own event here, and Jesus did 2 temple cleansings? Whatever your viewpoint, it's still a bridge, and it's still an awareness that's going to lead into the discourse that's going to happen between Jesus and Nicodemus in chapter 3. With that being said, your conservative scholars are going to take the viewpoint that this is a separate cleansing. So Jesus, in his ministry, in his 3.5 years ministry, he actually did 2 cleansings. One at the beginning of his ministry and also one at the end of his ministry. Reason why I would believe that Jesus did 2 temple cleansings is because this perfectly, again, leads up to the public notice of Jesus. Jesus' first miracle, remember, did within his own family and close friends. They're the only ones that saw. So for him to be so known and popular at this point, his first time back into Jerusalem, his first time going into public ministry, where he's done no other signs, no other miracles, he's not known at all, or at least as to this degree. So to get the attention of not only the crowd and the people, but also of the leaders of the Pharisees, just like what John the Baptist did. But remember, John the Baptist was baptizing for a while, and then finally the leaders came out and started questioning him. The same thing, what's going on with Jesus here, he's going to make a public statement of who he is, what's he about, and he's doing it in a way that's purifying any wrongdoing in this temple. So, leading into this, making this huge spectacle, this huge display of hundreds of thousands of people, and making this statement for everyone to see, makes it believable that this is an isolated, unique, its own event here done in the first part of Jesus' ministry, and then Jesus does another cleansing later on. Let's look also from the viewpoint of the disciples. Let's not forget, they see Jesus doing this, preserving this celebration, preserving this wedding feast, right? And doing this amazing miracle that he had actually, then he did it through them, of the turning water into wine by their obedience, right? Or they witness this amazing miracle that just happened. They come down and they can't wait to share. They can't wait to share their testimony, to share what just happened with people that they know. And the first thing Jesus does when he comes in to cleanse the table, he basically erases all of that for at least a moment, with Jesus displaying and purifying this temple and making this display of driving out the animals and overturning the money changers. And saying, and as we read in verse 16, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise or a den of thieves." The disciples, in seeing this, basically two extremes here. One done so privately, one done so publicly. One done in basically secret, only the disciples knew that this was water and wine, and one done so vociferous and with zeal and with passion, and everyone knew. The disciples are now fixated and focused on what Jesus is doing in this temple. They might be in a little bit of, they might be thrown back. They're probably most likely thrown back right now. And with Jesus just making this much of a disruption, if anyone were to make this type of disruption at a game, right, they'd be taken in custody and taken away. But no, Jesus was not. They approached him. He had a conversation. He said, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise, of a business." And they remember. And they're seeing this. They're not doing anything to Jesus. They're coming to question him, not to come to take him away for disturbing what was going on. They're coming to question him. One, that's a miracle in itself, and of God preserving Jesus. It's not his time yet. Moving on to verse 18 through 22. "So the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign do you show us, since you do these things?' Jesus answered and said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' Then the Jews said, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he has risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Jesus had said." This is the second temple that was ever built. We have the Solomon's temple that was built in 953 BC, but it was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. Then, when the Jews were allowed to come back, Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, in 517 BC. But it was not a good replica of Solomon's temple. And Herod, because of not the pureness and looking after Solomon's temple, but because of his own pride, he wanted to be the great. That's why he's known as Herod the Great. He wanted the notice. That's why he transformed it to Zerubbabel's temple, which we really rarely hear of, but we know Herod's temple, right? Because Herod took Zerubbabel's temple and basically did a remodel on it. And he started that remodel in 20 BC. So, it said it'd take 46 years, right? So in 20 BC up to 46 years brings us to 26 AD. This also confirms that Jesus in Luke was 30 years old when he was baptized, when he started his ministry, his public ministry. Okay? Jesus is believed to be born in 4 BC. 4 BC plus 26 years AD makes this also 30 years into Jesus' life. It's pretty awesome when we find hard evidence that links from one part of the Bible to another part of the Bible stating the same thing. We have in Luke stating that Jesus started his ministry when he was 30 years old, and we have here, based on simple math, that Jesus in John also is 30 years old when he cleanses this temple. So we're at 26 AD. We do know that this temple was not yet completed, though. It is believed that was completed in 63 AD, which, going off just real quickly, 63 AD, we had 83 years from when Herod started this remodel to when it was finally finished. 83 years. And we know that the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Just because of the revolt of the Jews. 83 years to finish this temple, and they enjoyed it for 7 years. Just think about that. But right now we're halfway through the remodel. We're 46 years in. And Jesus says that if you destroy this temple, and in 3 days I would raise it up, talking about the temple of his body. The Jews misunderstood this, the leaders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin. Whoever was talking to Jesus at that time, or the leaders, misunderstood. Jesus was talking obviously about the temple of his body. It says the disciples remembered this, correct? After he died and rose again. And also this led them to believe as well. Jesus, throughout his time with the disciples, gives them insight and reveals what is going to happen. But it wasn't until that event actually took place that everything seemed to come together and their belief was confirmed. God is continually giving me and giving you insight into his plan for us, into what he wants us to do. But at times we just can't grasp it. We don't fully understand it. And a lot of the times it's not until that event takes place or that situation occurs that we are finally have our eyes open and understand what God was telling us through this journey up until this point. And that's where the disciples, this is the first conversation that Jesus is having, that we have here, when Jesus had with the disciples, talking about his death. Of course, they're not going to fully understand what Jesus is saying here. But they did not forget it. They kept it with them. And John records that when Jesus died and rose again, that all these times Jesus said that destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. That's what the disciples remembered. Obviously, the Jewish leaders did not get that he was speaking of his body, but thought he was speaking of the physical temple. The physical temple is the old representation of what the temple that God dwells in now. God doesn't dwell in the Holy of Holies. Remember when Jesus died, the temple veil that separated God from everyone else was ripped from top to bottom. It was top to bottom, it was ripped. It was too tall for any man to stand and reach the top. But God did an amazing spectacle of ripping this veil from top to bottom. The imagery is just so precious and clear that no longer is God dwelling in a man-made building. But God is dwelling in a God-created being made in his own image. In us who believe. And the same requirements and the zeal that Jesus had for this temple is the same zeal and requirements that Jesus has for our own hearts, of the pureness of our hearts. Yes, we are saved by grace through faith. But that zeal, that passion, that reverence that Jesus is displaying here in this purifying the temple is the same type of purification that we need to ensure that happens inside our hearts. Because that same God that dwells in that temple is the same God that dwells inside of our hearts and demands that respect and demands that reverence. That's what Jesus is displaying here. Verse 23 through 25. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them, because he knew all men, and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. You go look at Hebrews 4:13. It says, "There is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give an account." We've heard of genuine faith. And in James it talks about, do not be deceived. Do not deceive yourself. Hundreds of thousands of people, at very least, heard at that time what Jesus had done. In fact, the word of mouth probably was so quick that before Jesus even left the temple, everyone in the city basically knew about it. So obviously, if Jesus is doing this, performing signs and miracles, people are going to be there to see, to want to witness that, to want to be a partaker and be a part of that. But just because they're there, just because they show interest, has nothing to do what really had they given over their heart to make Jesus their Lord and their Savior. In Romans it talks about that if you confess with your mouth, this is Romans 10:9 and 10, that if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. That right there. That if you believe in your heart and confess with your mouth, if you are a doer of his work. Are you changed from inside? Is your heart pure? Or are you just there to just say that you're there? Are you a spectator, just witnessing all this going on? Are you a one that's going to partake and join Jesus and follow Jesus and forsake all to follow Jesus? That's what being a disciple of Jesus is all about. Is same thing what Paul says as we looked at in our first lesson in our introduction to John of what a disciple is. Right? Come follow me as I imitate Christ. Follow Jesus and imitate him. That's what these disciples are doing. And Jesus is making it very clear that if you're not willing to follow to the point where you're going to be imitating with Jesus because you are changed from within, then Jesus has, it says here in verse 24, but he did not commit himself to them because he knew all men. In verse 25, that had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was man. He did not commit himself to them, but he committed himself to his disciples. Why? Because they not only believed, but they chose to surrender their life, to surrender who they are, their identity, and make now their identity as followers of Christ, followers of Jesus. You can't fool Jesus. You can fool everyone else, but you cannot fool Jesus. In Hebrews it says we come to him naked. All of our baggage, all of our hidden stuff that we have, that we hide from everyone else, all the masks that we wear, all of that is in the open before Jesus. Don't try to fool him. If you're struggling understanding, if you're struggling and have questions, if you're just putting on a face for everyone else because you think it's the right thing to do, if you've been a churchgoer for many, many years since you can remember, but yet you never surrendered yourself to Christ to make him your Lord and your Savior, you can fool everyone else. You can do all the right things. You can say all the right things. You can serve. You can do all this stuff. Jesus knows your heart. He knows if it's pure or not. He knows if you've given your life over to him and become a disciple of Jesus. So stop trying to hide things. Be real with him. Whether you're going to follow him or not, be real with him. He committed himself to his disciples because they chose and they came after him. They chose to follow him, and he received them with open arms. It's those that have not chosen to follow Jesus that he has not committed himself to them either. So why don't you? Why don't you commit yourself? Don't just be a spectator. Be a partaker. Be a disciple of Christ. Make that decision. And truly believe that what we are studying and what John has written in this gospel, that these are written that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing we may have life in his name, to make God your Lord, your God. Jesus shows here his authority and his passion and zeal and demand that God requires us to have a pure heart when we come before him. And with this public display, it brings us and it leads us into Nicodemus coming to Jesus at night, starting in chapter 3.